We're looking at the book of Joshua, and for some people, of course, Joshua might seem like an old, irrelevant book about an ancient nation and its battles, but of course, we know better. This is part of God's word, and Joshua is helping us see how God is going to keep his promise to reverse the curse. It's part of this big story that God is telling. He made a promise to an old man named Abraham about him having descendants and giving those descendants land. And when they enter the land, he gave Abraham's descendants a plan for how they could bring blessing to the world. And as we look at Joshua, we are trying to learn, how is God going to keep his promise? Is God going to keep his promise? And is Israel going to keep their commitment to God? And we have looked at the first several chapters of Joshua so far. Joshua 1 to 5 is really about God preparing the people to enter the land. And then in Joshua 6 to 12, we're looking at God accomplishing great victories for the people so that they're able to enter the land. And we've come to chapter 10 of Joshua, where God illustrates his absolute supremacy. Accomplishing salvation for his people has never been hard for God. You name the obstacle, God can overcome that obstacle. In chapter 10, there are a number of kings that come and gather together to go to war against God's people, and God absolutely humiliates them. And after explaining the way in which God accomplishes this victory for his people in chapter 10, verse 29 through chapter 11, the book of Joshua recounts how Israel conquered the cities in the south and in the north of Canaan. And as you look at chapter 11, verses 1 through 5 in particular, you see how the author goes into great detail about all these different kings who came out to war against Israel, and even describes their horses and chariots. What does he say about them in chapter 11, verse 4? He says, they came out with all their troops, a great horde in number, like the sand that is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. And why does the author do this, you think? Why does he go into such great detail? It's to help us see the extent of God's sovereign power. What does Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 1 tell Israel not to do in this situation, and why? Moses prepared them for this. Moses said, when you go out to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army larger than your own, you shall not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God is with you, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. As Israel faces this tremendous enemy, Moses says, don't be afraid. Why? Because God is with you. And throughout all of these battles, Joshua is presented as a model leader for Israel. And perhaps in some ways, this is part of the book's purpose, actually. Part of the purpose is to show future leaders of Israel how they can be successful. Joshua 11:15. Just as the Lord commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded. This is it. Trust the Lord. Do what he says. It may sound boring, but that's really the key to successful biblical leadership. Chapter 12 records for us all the different kings that were defeated by Moses and Joshua. He begins in verses 1 to 6 by describing the kings that were defeated before they crossed the Jordan. You remember how there were 2.5 tribes that didn't have land across the Jordan, but they were given land on the other side. And this recounting of the kings that were defeated where they lived is probably here to give them assurance that God really was for them, and God really did want them to be part of Israel, even though they lived on the other side of the Jordan. Yes, he had done great things to bring the other tribes into the promised land, but he had proven himself faithful to them as well. Now, obviously, we might read this list of kings here and become a little bored because we don't know any of them. But this list of kings would have been anything but boring to the people to whom God had brought into the promised land, because each one of them was a demonstration that God keeps his promises. Imagine all this power lined up against God, and God was able to defeat each one and do just what he had promised his people he would. In chapters 1 through 5, we saw how Israel needed to keep God's word if they were going to be successful. In chapters 6 through 12, we see how God kept his. And now, as we move out of chapter 12 into chapter 13 and following, really, we're in a third section in the book of Joshua, and we're looking at Israel again to see how they did once they entered the land in obeying God. Specifically, the third section of Joshua describes how Israel divided the land, chapters 13 through 21. And for us, this section of Joshua is very dry. But to the Israelites, it would have been pretty much the opposite, because God's describing the handing out of their inheritance. Anytime I'm in a part of the Bible that I think is dry, it motivates me to look more carefully, because I realize God included it for a reason. And God included this section of Joshua for a reason. Can you imagine the Israelites' anticipation all these years of receiving an inheritance from God, and when they finally received it, how excited they must have been? This is like a description of a will, you might say. Can you imagine waiting for an inheritance all your life and then falling asleep as the lawyer reads the will? Though Israel had achieved a great deal of dominance in the land of Canaan by this point, the beginning of chapter 13 tells us there was still more to be conquered. Verse 1 begins, "Now Joshua was old and advanced in years, and the Lord said to him, 'You are old and advanced in years.'" I love that. "And there remains yet very much land to possess." God's acknowledging here that Joshua is not as strong as he used to be, but after describing the land that yet remains to be conquered, he gives his people encouragement by saying, "I myself will drive them out before the people of Israel." Now, unfortunately, though God made this promise in terms of the rest of Canaan, it seems Israel wasn't as vigilant as they should have been in terms of their responsibilities in the land that they had already been given. Because in verse 13 of chapter 13, we read, "Yet the people of Israel did not drive out the Geshurites or the Maccathites, but Gesher and Maccath dwell in the midst of Israel to this day." So they didn't finish the race, you might say. They started well, but they didn't finish. And that's discouraging, of course. But to encourage us, in chapter 14, God gives us an example of how the Israelites should have acted in the land in the form of Caleb. Even though Caleb was an old man at this point, 85 years old, he wanted to be given the hill country so he could go up and drive out the Canaanites in obedience to God's word. Verse 12, "So now," Caleb says, "give me this hill country of which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on that day how the Anakim were there with great fortified cities. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out just as the Lord said." Caleb trusted God. But in contrast to Caleb's faith, when later we read the people of Joseph respond to Joshua in 17:14, we see that they refuse to trust God. They are great and they are numerous, but they complain about their inheritance. And Joshua responds by pointing out the areas that they can settle, but they respond to Joshua by saying how afraid they were. They say, "The hill country is not enough for us, yet all the Canaanites who dwell in the plain have chariots of iron, but those in Beth-shean and its villages, and those in the valley of Jezreel." Here we see that choices lay before the people of Israel. Will they respond like Caleb, with a faith that spurs them on to greater obedience? Or will they respond like the tribes of Joseph, with unbelief, which causes them to complain and cower in fear and fail to take advantage of the great gifts that God had given them? Sadly, in the midst of all these reminders of God's faithfulness to his promises and the dividing up of the land, we're also being given hints of Israel's unfaithfulness. This was actually a very good generation of Israelites, maybe one of the best, but they weren't completely faithful to God, and we're going to see the consequences of that in the future. What do we find recorded in Joshua 15, verse 63? But the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the Jerusalem, the people of Judah could not drive out. So the Jebusites dwell with the people of Judah at Jerusalem to this day. Joshua 16:10. However, they did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. So the Canaanites have lived in the midst of Ephraim to this day, but have been made to do forced labor. Joshua 17:12 and 13. Yet the people of Manasseh could not take possession of those cities, but the Canaanites persisted in dwelling in that land. Now when the people of Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not utterly drive them out. And we might think this was simply because they weren't strong enough or some sort of military problem. But what question does Joshua ask the people in Joshua 18:3? And what does this question indicate about what was really behind them not conquering the land? Joshua 18:3, Joshua said to the people of Israel, "How long will you put off going in to take possession of the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you?" They were not being as faithful as they should have been to obey God's command. And we're really disobeying. And though we don't see all the results of this disobedience yet, one book later we will. The move from Joshua to Judges is really a sad move. God had given them a reason for these commands, and Israel fails to persevere in the task he had given them. And as they fail, we will realize in just a short period of time, they are producing suffering for the generations that follow. It is a little discouraging, honestly, to see Israel already failing to obey God, but at the same time, we're being encouraged as we see individuals who obeyed God. For example, chapter 14 begins with the faithfulness of Caleb, but then we see Joseph and their fear in chapter 17, the tribes of Joseph. And then we see the 7.5 tribes and their laziness in chapter 18. And then in chapter 19, which is a section about the allotment or giving out of the land and inheritance, it concludes with the inheritance given to Joshua in verses 49 and 50. It's like the book is saying, in spite of Israel's unfaithfulness, there were men who were exceptions. You remember that both Joshua and Caleb had been faithful and trusted God when the whole nation did not, and God promised them an inheritance as a result. And here we see God kept his promise to them, and they stand up once again as examples to us, even as the rest of the world is failing to believe and failing to obey God. We want to be like Joshua and Caleb. We want to be among the remnant that chooses to believe God and his promises, because he always does what he says. What's amazing about Joshua and the Bible really is that even though Israel is failing and not completely keeping God's word, God is always keeping his promises. And we see that in the next few chapters. In chapter 20, we read how God made provision for the people, not only to have land, but to enjoy the land as a place of peace and justice. And he commands these cities of refuge to keep people from pursuing vigilante justice. And then in chapter 21, we see one of God's strategies for helping the people maintain pure worship. He scatters Levites throughout the land of Canaan, and they were, as John Calvin once put it, appointed as kinds of guardians in every district to retain the people in the pure worship of God. Chapter 21 concludes with one of the most important passages in the whole book of Joshua. One author calls Joshua 21 verses 43 to 45 the theological heart of the book, the jugular vein. Verse 43 describes chapters 13 to 21 in summary. Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. Verse 44 describes chapters 1 to 12, and the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given their enemies into their hands. And verse 45 summarizes the whole story of Joshua. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. And the overarching point of this passage is that God should be praised for his faithfulness to Israel. Obviously, as we've read through Joshua, we see there still are enemies in the land, and the writer of Joshua knew that. This is a broad summary statement. It's a word of praise. As the ESV Study Bible explains, although Israel did in fact take possession of the land and settle there, much work remained to be done. But the key point is that the Lord has been utterly true to his good promises. Not one has failed. All came to pass. And finally, in chapters 22 through 24, we discover God's strategy for how Israel would be able to remain in the land. Chapters 1 to 5, God prepares them to enter the land, trust and obey. Chapters 6 through 12, God keeps his promises as they enter the land. Chapters 13 through 21, we have some question marks. We're excited as God is giving the land to the people, but we're concerned because the people aren't being completely faithful to God. In chapters 22 through 24, we are given just one final call to the people. This is how you need to act. This is what you need to do if you're going to enjoy the inheritance that God is giving you. In chapter 22, Joshua encourages the eastern tribes for their obedience, and he blesses them and sends them home. They return home and they build an altar, and the western tribes hear about that, and they actually get upset. Behold, the people of Reuben, Joshua writes, and the people of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh have built the altar at the frontier of the land of Canaan in the region about the Jordan on the side that belongs to the people of Israel. And when the people of Israel heard of it, the whole assembly of the people of Israel gathered at Shiloh to make war against them. And this is how serious idolatry is. They're concerned. Are they starting to worship idols now that they've gone back to their land? And the eastern tribes explain, no, they had a good reason for this. No, but we did it from fear that in the time to come your children might say to our children, what have you to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? For the Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you, you people of Reuben and people of Gad. You have no portion in the Lord, so your children might make our children cease to worship the Lord. Therefore we said, let us now build an altar, not for burnt offering, nor for sacrifice, but to be a witness between us and you. And so really this chapter gives us hope for Israel, in that all of Israel does seem to be united in a desire to honor and serve God. And in chapter 23, Joshua addresses the leaders of Israel and he challenges them to always stay so faithful. Even though it's been years now since Joshua received his commission back in chapter 1, it's clear he's embraced what God taught him wholeheartedly. Before they entered the land, God said, be strong, be courageous, meditate on the law, obey it. After they enter the land, here Joshua says, be strong, obey God's law, meditate on it, and obey it, and you will experience success. Fail to do so, you will be punished. And so he reminds them of God's faithfulness. He anticipates God's future faithfulness. He challenges them to obedience. He gives them motivations for obedience. He calls on them to love God. He warns them what will happen if they don't. And he summarizes his warning by saying God will be just as faithful to his threats as he has been to his promises if you disobey him. And so the key question this book leaves us with then is not about God. God has a plan. God has made promises and he is able to keep his promises. You wonder about that? He got these people into the land. He got them exactly where he said he would get them all those years before. He's made promises in the covenant about the land. He's kept those promises. Now Israel has the land. There's no question about God and his faithfulness. The question, however, is about Israel. God's kept his word. Will Israel keep theirs? And we'll begin to get the answer to that question as we look at the book of Judges.